A homeless little black kid is seen educating his white daughter by a white billionaire. His life was forever altered by what he did next. "Now, get your filthy hands off my kid." The voice was like a knife piercing the morning air. Standing 10 meters away, Richard Blackstone's $3,000 suit stood out sharply against the image that his eyes were unable to comprehend. Her daughter Sophie, the heir of a $200 million real estate dynasty, was seated on the ground with a black child who was barefoot, both of them hunched over books that were strewn across the grass. Kiara Johnson cautiously raised her eyes as Sophie hurriedly wrote notes in his notebook for the first time in months. Truly paying attention to his studies, while the unidentified girl, who looked to be around 12 years old, muttered mathematical explanations. As though she had anticipated this moment, she showed no signs of surprise or anxiety. With a dignity that caused Richard to pause for a while, she brushed the grass from her hands and rose up, gently closing the book she was carrying. "She's assisting me with algebra, Dad." Sophie objected, although her voice wavered. "At last, I comprehend the equations." "Sophie, leave her right away," Richard said, his gaze locked on the odd girl who had the audacity to enter his personal space. "How did you get in here? Where are the security guards?" Kia said nothing. But Richard couldn't help but feel uneasy about something in her Isa tranquilly that was too old for her age. His own security officers showed their dazed, panting, and running. "We don't know how she survived, sir. We looked at every camera." Kiara had been observing the Blackstone Mansion's security procedures for 2 months. Every shift change, blind spot, each distraction. Not intentionally, but in a state of despair. Her mother walked the streets in insane episodes, shouting at phantom demons, and she wanted a safe place to study. The library of the mansion had windows that looked out over the garden. Kiara peered through the glass, whispering the right answers to herself as Sophie toiled alone in the afternoons with schoolwork that cost more than some people make in a year. Until Sophie saw his one day. Sophie had walked up to the fence where Kiara was hiding and asked, "Do you know algebra?" "I know everything," was Kiara's straightforward response. Richard snapped his fingers at the security officers, interrupting her recollection. "But I don't go to school. Make a police call. Trespassing." Sophie positioned herself between Kiara and the men and said, "No, there is nothing wrong with her." "Don't argue with me, Sophie," Richard replied, lowering his voice to the ominous tone he employed to seal million-dollar agreements. "This girl isn't supposed to be here." At last, Kiara's voice was solid and clear. "You're correct. I'm not supposed to be here. However, prior to my arrival, your daughter was failing 5 classes." The ensuing hush was deafening, bewildered. Richard blinked. "What were you saying?" "Sophie's dyslexia is undiagnosed," Kia went on coolly. "She inverts letters and numbers for this reason. It's not foolishness. It's simply a different way of thinking. If a teacher had truly looked at her rather than just collecting tuition, they should have recognized anything." Sophie's eyes were wide as she gazed at Kiara. No one had ever been able to convey her struggles without making her feel foolish. Something changed in Richard's chest. "How are you aware of that?" "Because I listen," Kiara answered. Something that money can't seem to purchase. The security personnel awaited orders. After glancing at his daughter, Richard turned to face the barefoot kid, who had just diagnosed what costly educators had failed to do for 2 years. It didn't make any sense. How could a homeless boy know things his own experts didn't? "Sophie," whispered Kiara. "I take it that's her name." Kiara gave a nod. "Kiara Johnson is the daughter of nobody important." Richard looked at her face. He was genuinely troubled by something in those eyes. It wasn't a surrender. Fear wasn't the reason. It was patience. She seemed to be anticipating something that only she knew was coming. "Where did you get all of your education knowledge?" Her tone softened as he inquired. For the first time, Kiara grinned. A secret smile. "Living on the streets teaches you a lot about people, Mr. Blackstone. And in the last 2 months, I've noticed a lot more about her than his private tutors have in years." Richard was cold. How was his name known to her? She was aware of the private tutors, but how? Above all, what more was she aware of? Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this tale of how a homeless girl transformed the life of an affluent family. Richard, his wealth, and all of Kia's significant contacts, could not have foreseen what transpired after he learnt the full scope of her knowledge. Richard folded his arms and examined the girl as though she were a business issue that needed to be resolved right then. Pay close attention, young girl. It won't work with me, but I'm not sure what game he's playing. My daughter doesn't require friendship masquerading as generosity. Calmly, Kiara said, it's not charity. It's true that Sophie has dyslexia. Because he doesn't care enough to watch, his private teachers, who charge $500 per hour, go unnoticed. Richard's expression grew stern. You dare to doubt specialists with the necessary qualifications. You don't even attend classes, perhaps. That is the reason I see what he cannot. At last, Kia lowered her gaze and muttered. A twinge of annoyance ran through Richard. It was astonishing how conceited this chick was. Johnson, he said, Kiara Johnson. He instantly searched on his cell phone by typing, here it is. Mother who has previously been admitted to a mental health facility. A homeless shelter's registered address. After the age of 9, no formal education. Kia winced a little, but said nothing. Can't you see that this chick is trying to manipulate you, Sophie? Richard went on, her voice adopting the patronizing tone he employed in business meetings. There are often hidden agendas among people like her. She is most likely attempting to enter our home to steal something or is pursuing money. Stop, Dad. With tears in her eyes, Sophie objected. She never requested food or anything else. Ignoring his daughter, Richard concentrated on Kiara. You have attempted to break into how many other mansions? Before selecting our family, how many other affluent families did you research? Richard hesitated as Kiara looked up for the first time with a peacefulness. Are you truly curious as to why I choose his family? Teach me, he remarked mockingly. Because the only child I ever saw in that yard crying by herself every afternoon was his daughter. Sophie lurked behind the library, trying to figure out maths problems and whimpering when she couldn't, while other wealthy children played or were picked up by chauffeurs. Richard's mouth froze. How was she aware of the location where Sophie constantly sought safety? I watched you for 2 months, Kiara added, her voice growing louder. He was too exhausted to inquire about Sophie's school when I saw him get home at 9 p.m. She knew you were under stress. So I caught her lying and said everything was good, because they had nothing else to do with a girl who was obviously not cut out for learning. I witnessed private tutors departing early. Richard's heart pounded, but her rage just intensified. You are not entitled to keep an eye on our family. With a firm eye wasn't watching, Kia answered. Your library has big windows, so I could see the books on the shelves while I was studying. I watched and learned everything I could during the day while Sophie wasn't there. It's impossible, Richard sniffed. You're homeless. You lack access to quality education. Kiara smiled slightly, but not enough to show her eyes. Papa, would you like to put me to the test? She is proficient in calculus. Sophie cut in right away. In 20 minutes, she educated me about derivatives. For 3 months, my private tutors made an effort. Richard's amazement was mingled with an unidentified emotion as he glanced at Kia and then at his daughter. Show it. Kiara approached Sophie's laptop, which was open on the garden table. Yesterday, Sophie was having trouble with chemistry, chemical equation balancing. She typed a complicated sequence in a hurry. The rule is straightforward. Preservation of mass. Every element must have an equal number of atoms on both sides of the equation. She completed 5 of Sophie's notebooks, difficult puzzles, in 3 minutes. Incredulous, Richard blinked. Where did you find out? When the public library is open. Cafes offer free internet. Books left in trash cans. Kia shut down her laptop coolly. Knowledge, Mr. Blackstone, is precious. No one can take it away from me, that's all. Most of Richard was angry, but a tiny, hesitant part of him was impressed. How could a destitute little girl be more capable than experts he paid a fortune to? regardless of your level of intelligence, he stated icily. This isn't where you belong. Sophie requires companions that belong to her own social class. Bradley Hoffman-like friends, Kiara whispered the question. Richard's heart froze. How are you familiar with that name? Sophie, a 15-year-old boy who is considered a friend by his business partner, was labeled intellectually incompetent in the school WhatsApp group. Kiara's head cocked. Or would you rather have pals like Vanessa White, who posed as Sophie's friend for 2 years in order to ask her father for money? Sophie appeared astonished. How are you aware of that? Because I pay attention. Sophie, pay attention. I want to know what makes you cry. I want to know what brought you joy when you chuckle. Kia looked across at Richard. Do you believe? Empathy is taught by socioeconomic class. Her father is too preoccupied with creating empires to see that she is drowning right in front of him, while her wealthy friends treat her like trash. The ensuing hush was jarring. Her hands trembled, Richard sensed, not only with rage, but with something she would not admit. Disgrace. Silently and dangerously, he said, You're out of line. Kiara nodded. I know. I've been out of line all my life. At least I'm here. Though Richard grabbed his cell phone and made a call. Come to the garden now, security. Have 5 minutes to leave his property, he said, hanging up and giving Kia a chilly glare. I'll contact the police if I see her here once more. It won't work, Kia muttered in Sophie's ear. But thank you for seeing her as a person. Kiara nodded calmly and started gathering his few possessions, some crumpled papers, and a broken pencil. Sophie raced to her and gave her a desperate hug. I'll figure something out, Sophie sobbed. I will not allow him to do this. Richard fought a sensation of unease as he watched the sight. What made him feel like the story's antagonist? Kiara made one final round as she made her way out, accompanied by security personnel. You have everything money can buy, Mr. Blackstone. However, her daughter continues to cry by herself every afternoon. Perhaps you ought to ask yourself why. Richard was left alone with a question he didn't want to answer once she vanished through the gates. Why had the comments of a destitute 12-year-old girl affected him more profoundly than any report from a financial analyst? Richard attempted to defend his behavior that evening as Sophie ate her dinner in silence and avoided talking to him. He had kept his family safe. He had prevented dangerous outsiders from entering her land. He had done what any good father would do. Why, therefore, did he believe that he had made the most significant error of his life? Richard was unaware that Kiara Johnson was more than just a bright young woman seeking opportunity. She had lived on the streets for years, learning to discern people's weaknesses so she could use her mind alone to survive. She had learnt much more about the Blackstone family than just Sophie's learning issues in those 2 months of observation. Secrets that would force a strong guy to reconsider his undervaluation of a youngster who had everything to prove and nothing to lose. Richard believed the issue was finally settled 3 weeks after the expulsion. The homeless girl knew where she belonged. Life had returned to normal, and Sophie had ceased calling her name. That's what he believed, anyway. Richard was unaware that Kia Johnson was more than just a bright young woman. She survived at the initial no. Survivors never give up. Richard took pride in his ability to handle a delicate issue in his business meetings, but Kiara spent her afternoons in the public library using the free computers in a very particular way. She was reading about dyslexia and learning advanced mathematics, but she was doing more than that. The Blackstone Corporation was the subject of her investigation, and she smiled in a way that would have given Richard chills when she discovered His business has earned millions of dollars from government contracts to construct public housing for years. The issue, Black and Hispanic families, who lacked the authority to voice their complaints, were the main target of the buildings, which were constructed on contaminated ground using subpar materials. In 2022, 23 kids in a Blackstone housing development had developed severe respiratory issues. Richard's solicitors were able to conceal the litigation that the parents had filed by threatening deportation and buying silence. Everything was printed by Kia contracts, internal emails that were released, medical records, and testimonies from impacted families. She had a folder thicker than Richard's own lawyer's papers in 2 weeks. In the library, a voice behind her said, "Can I help you?" Kiara turned to see a 50-something woman with grey hair and reading spectacles dangling from her neck. Kiara warily said, "I'm just studying," to the ID card that said, "Professor Janet Williams, Social Advocacy." Janet glanced at the glowing Blackstone Corporation emblem on the computer screen. "Many people I know have been harmed by that company. Are you related to him in any way?" Kiara paused. "I have a personal interest, let's say." "What sort of curiosity?" "The kind where justice is done at the end." Janet took a seat beside him, curious. "I oversee a legal assistance initiative for impoverished communities while teaching law at the nearby university. We can speak if he knows anything about Blackstone's misconduct." Kiara examined her woman's face. "What knowledge do you have regarding prejudice in education?" "Everything. For 20 years, that has been my area of expertise. And about the billionaires who believe they can use skin color to determine who should have access to information." Janet bent over. "Tell me about her." Kiara told her everything for 2 hours. The recognition of her dyslexia, the humiliating expulsion, her friendship with Sophie, and most importantly, the precise words Richard had used. There are often hidden agendas among people like her. When Kia was done, Janet stated, "We have a case. Denial of educational opportunities, racial discrimination, and if his information regarding the housing contracts is accurate, corporate fraud. However, I'm only a young child without a home. Will anyone trust me over Richard Blackstone?" Janet grinned. "You don't get it, honey. They don't have to trust you. We want Richard to think that he can simply ruin you. The same mistake is always made by arrogant people. They undervalue those they ought not to." Richard was in his office, getting a report from his private investigator while they were making plans. "The young girl still goes to the public library. She seems to be studying, sir. Nothing out of the ordinary. Richard told her to keep an eye on her. People who are desperate will do desperate things. There should be no surprises." However, Richard made a critical error. In his conceit, he mandated Sophie's relocation to a Boston boarding school. Sophie argued, screamed, and pleaded. Far from unsuitable influences, Richard insisted. It's for her personal benefit. She must develop the ability to interact with members of her own social class. Richard was unaware that Sophie had preserved the cell phone number that Kiara had surreptitiously provided her weeks before in her desperation. She called as soon as she could. "It's Sophie, Kiara. I am being sent away by my father. He claims that he is to blame." "I understand," Kiara said coolly. "He believes that his issue would be resolved if he keeps me away from you. How will we proceed?" "Sophie, we're not going to take any action. You will be content when you get to Boston. You intend to study. New friends will be made for you. You will prove to your father that you have always been intelligent. How about you?" Kiara examined the document folder on Professor Janet's desk. "Those who believe they can discard children just because they were born in the wrong area will learn a lesson from me. His father, Kiara Sophie, believes he is a power-hungry individual. He thinks that everything can be purchased with money. Justice, obedience, and silence. He needs to be reminded that even $200 million cannot control everything in this world." Kiara opened the first volume of case law Janet had lent her when she hung up. She still had a lot of work to do. People who grew up on the streets knew exactly how to turn the haughtiness of the strong against her. And Richard Blackstone had totally misjudged the person he was dealing with. Richard's office received a registered mail 3 days later, just the legal company address, no sender. When he opened it, he found a single typed line. "There are lessons that cost $200 million. Prepare for yours." Laughing, he crumpled the paper and tossed it in the garbage. Desperate people's empty threats. He might not have been laughing, though, if he could have seen Kiara sitting next to Janet in the library, going over government contracts and putting together a dossier that would rock his enterprise to its core. You are building the very monster that will eat you alive when you undervalue someone who has nothing to lose. Richard was going to learn that teaching humility to people who believe they are untouchable is a skill that must be acquired by surviving in situations where he could never survive for even a day. Richard laughed and tossed the menacing letter in the trash 6 weeks later. His aide burst into his office as he was signing another multi-million-dollar contract. He has a paper-pale face. Reporters are at the door of the corporation. Mr. Blackstone, many reporters. Richard scowled. Most likely, regarding Miami's new housing development, tell them to hold off. No, sir. They want to know about the sick kids and Riverside Gardens. Richard's heart froze. He had buried the 2022 housing project, Riverside Gardens. Years before, with the aid of costly attorneys and calculated bribes. How on earth was that discovered? He almost fell out of his chair as he switched on the TV. CNN showed a reporter with a bulky dossier standing in front of a pediatric hospital. According to exclusive papers our station was able to secure, Blackstone Corporation was aware of the potential for contamination on the property where it constructed public housing that was largely meant for low-income families. Threats and intimidation were used to quiet the parents of 23 children who experienced severe respiratory issues. The screen displayed images of contracts that Richard had signed, internal emails that discussed acceptable public health costs, and even more heartbreaking recordings of meetings in which he himself had said, "If they can't afford better lawyers, it's not his problem." The answer came in the form of a call to his private cell phone. Unknown number. "Hello, Mr. Blackstone. This is Kiara Johnson. Remember me, the street girl you kicked off your property?" Richard gripped the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "How did you get this number?" "The same way I got his. Company's contracts, the recordings of his executive meetings, and the emails he believed he had permanently erased." Kia's voice was calm, almost gentle. "You're a kid. I'm a kid who watched her family for 2 months, sir. That's enough time to install a little program on the laptop Sophie used in the garden, a program that allowed me access to the entire Blackstone family home network." Kia paused, mentioning his home office where he held video conferences with his lawyers about how to silence the families of Riverside Gardens. Richard felt like the world was spinning around him. That's illegal. Invasion of privacy. Do you know what else is? Richard's phone started ringing non-stop. Periodicals, newspapers, and other channels. The tale quickly went viral on social media within 20 minutes. One of the most talked about subjects on Twitter was Blackstone corruption. "What are you looking for?" Richard asked, her arrogance turning to desperation. "Justice," Kiara said plainly. "Something that you believed you could conceal, sell, or purchase. But during those weeks of law school with Professor Janet Williams, you know what I learnt. There is no such thing as justice. It is irreplaceable and cannot be bargained for. We can figure this out. Listen. What is your desired amount?" "$1 million, $2 million, Kiara chuckled. A real kid's chuckle that stood in stark contrast to the ingenuity of her scheme. "You don't understand, do you, Mr. Blackstone? His shady money is not what I want. I want him to cover the costs of the 23 sick children. I want you to know that conceited white billionaires are not always as dangerous as black street girls, and I want the families to be fairly compensated." Black vans were parked in front of the building when Richard peered out the window. Boxes and equipment were being carried up the stairs by federal agents. He said, "How?" Into the phone. Kia gently clarified, "Professor Janet Williams knows a lot of interesting people at the Department of Justice. Those who have been waiting for years for credible proof against Blackstone Corporation. I just got them the Christmas present he requested." Richard hung up the phone. The reporter on TV declared that Blackstone Corporation's stock had fallen 80% in less than 2 hours. According to others familiar with the investigation, this might only be the beginning. Richard recalled the barefoot girl he had expelled from his property 6 weeks prior while the agent searched his office. The girl he had referred to as an intruder, a manipulator, and someone like her was now methodically undermining all he had worked so hard to build over the past 20 years. His phone rang again. "Are you still there, Kia, Mr. Blackstone?"
"What?
Are you looking for from me? Deflated, he asked. I want you to keep this call in mind. I want you to keep in mind that underestimating people is not only cruel, but also foolish every time you see a poor child on the street. Her tone grew softer. Above all, I want Sophie to grow up in a society where females like me may pursue their education without having to conceal. For the first time in weeks, Richard recalled his daughter, Sophie, and whispered to her. She called me yesterday from Boston. She claimed to have finally realized that she is simply different, not stupid. She added that, despite our brief friendship, she is glad to have had someone like me. Kiara hesitated. Mr. Blackstone, do you know what the saddest thing that happened throughout our chat was? Richard was unable to respond. She expressed her wish that her father may one day be as proud of her as I always was. A homeless girl's unreserved affection is what a millionaire girl dreams about. Kiara let out a sigh. Because of your defense of unworthy views, you nearly lost your amazing daughter. The call was cut off. As federal officials removed boxes of evidence that a 12-year-old girl had gathered more skillfully than his own internal auditors, Richard watched in silence as her life fell apart on television. Kiara Johnson was sitting on the public library steps outside the building. Using the cell phone Janet had provided her to watch the news. She had received a message from Sophie. I watched it on television. My father was deserving. You're great. The world was full of Richard Blackstones, who needed to learn that underestimating the right people could cost much more than $200 million, it could cost everything. 6 months later, Richard Blackstone was sitting in a modest suburban apartment, far from the mansion he had lost to pay damages. Kiara smiled and typed back, Justice isn't revenge, it's education. Maybe now he'll learn. She then put her phone away, picked up his borrowed law books, and went into the library because she had a lot. His former billionaire friends had stopped returning his calls. And Blackstone Corporation had gone bankrupt, but for the first time in years, he was actually speaking to Sophie. Did you notice, Dad? Kiara had won a full scholarship to Harvard, Sophie told him, showing him the news on her tablet. Law, she's going to specialize in social justice. Richard looked at the picture of the girl who had ruined her life and grinned strangely, saying, She deserves it. Sophie blinked, surprised. Aren't you angry? I'm ashamed, Richard said. She taught him that character is not defined by social class. I defined mine when I chose to humiliate her rather than listen to her. That same week, Kiara received an unexpected letter from Richard, handwritten, saying, Thank you for showing me who I really am. Being her buddy makes my daughter proud, and I ought to have been. As you altered our world, may you change the globe as well. Kiara carefully stored the letter. The goal of justice was not to ruin people. Its purpose was to emphasize that everyone is entitled to respect and opportunities, regardless of where they were born. As a civil rights office intern, Kia assisted in the drafting of the first statute, which was passed 2 years later. Street children get free access to educational materials. In honor of the friend who viewed her as a person, when everyone else saw her as an intruder. The bill was named the Sophie Blackstone Act. Richard, who currently serves as a consultant for NOSs that provide affordable housing, observed the signing event on TV. Kiara and her daughter stood side by side, grinning. He had acquired something that money could never purchase, but he had lost an empire. Her sincere adoration, and the lesson that it is not only unkind, but also foolish, to underestimate individuals. The destruction of Richard Blackstone was not Kiara's actual form of retaliation. It was to become precisely what he claimed she was incapable of being. Someone who would alter laws, safeguard children in danger, and demonstrate that dignity and intelligence are not fixed. A youngster should never be judged based on circumstances they did not pick. Human potential is unaffected by a person's bank account, skin color, or zip code. The people society has trained you to overlook can sometimes teach you the most important things. For more tales that demonstrate how true brilliance always finds its way, regardless of how many barriers are put in its path, please subscribe to the channel if this one inspired you.